Right to a channel of light fluid. Dead in the Water by MC Morrado. In December of 1991, a Canadian freighter ship and crew were on their way to Iceland after departing from a Nova Scotia seaport. The vessel is a Great Lakes freighter, built in early 1980. The whole pilot house and crew quarters are situated at the back of the boat, with goods and other things set to be delivered across the Atlantic Ocean. A 21-person crew manned the vessel, with emphasis on cabin crew and mechanics in the engine room. A Canadian lynx from Quebec was busy checking for fuel oil leaks in the engine room. He's Curtis, a young French-Canadian lad fresh from university. Anything to pay the bills, as Curtis always says to himself in his own mind. Other crew members often tease Curtis for speaking French, although not maliciously. "What you got there?" Curtis asked a nearby co-worker smoking a joint. "Oh, way to chill. I thought you got your rocks off licking frogs, bud." A timber wolf by the name of George chuckled, casually smoking weed despite not being allowed to. "No?" the lynx replied, not knowing what he meant. The giant main engine was running at full speed, turning 119 revolutions per minute. Generators running other parts of the engine room, called the generator room, were producing onboard power for the whole vessel. Diesel is the lifeblood of a big freighter such as this one, and also can get fairly loud to drown other noises in the vicinity. George scoffed, wandering off somewhere to smoke a joint in peace where nobody could see him. Curtis got back to work inspecting fuel oil pipes in the engine room, while lastly inspecting the main engine. Curtis was originally offered a job to work on a cruise ship, but he turned it down in favour of being a mechanic aboard freighters and cargo ships. The lynx has standards, knowing being a mechanic on goods transporting ship is more respected and pays more. Cruise ships in the eyes of a cargo sailor, or at least this vessel's crew, are viewed as fancy yet also very tacky. Meanwhile, a tall moose by the name of Robert was in the crew quarters sweeping floors and tidying up the crew cabin above the engine room. Just as he finished sweeping the floors, he suddenly shed his antlers that fell on the floor. Robert sighed, feeling the top of his head as the two spots where antlers grew out of were bleeding pretty well, oxygenated red blood dripping down. "That time of the month, eh?" an Arctic Fox crew member said while walking past Robert, knowing it was the winter season at this time. Robert picked up his shed antlers to put them in a closet, with all the shed antlers as part of a personal collection. Other crew members see him as the guy who does the animal equivalent of putting old nail clippings in a jar for who knows what. Robert got to cleaning the blood off his head with paper towels soaked in hydrogen peroxide in front of a bathroom mirror. "Oh, I'd have to be born a moose beast, man. These fucking things just fall right off," Robert grumbled to himself, dabbing the source of the bleeding with cotton balls soaked in isopropyl alcohol. Some moose don't shed antlers, while some do, which is the case with that moose janitor. His own quarters are very standard, like with almost every other crew member, with the finest technology 1980 had to offer, or a lack of. Outside the crew cabin and engine room situated after the freighter was a large blizzard out in this part of the ocean between Canada and Greenland. Frost and snow was building up on porthole windows, making it impossible to see outside. Condensation build-up on windows formed inside the vessel, with the freighter's heating system cranked to full blast during temperatures colder than -10 degrees Celsius. The bridge where the vessel is controlled and steered was having a hard time with all the relentless blizzard at sea. Electrically actuated windshield wipers struggled with increasingly aggressive snow, as those attempted to keep the windows on the bridge clean. The captain announced an order to slow down the ship to half speed from full throttle. Curtis was hard at work in the engine room, flipping switches and pressing buttons in an office-like small room to slow down the main engine. A couple of other feline mechanics were sitting down on chairs, being fairly lazy, drinking cups of hot cocoa. "My generators are due for an overhaul. Like almost 2,000 hours overdue for it, actually." Curtis told the other mechanics in the office as he checked the maintenance schedule of one of the generators. "So, not having any problems yet, just leave it," one of the other feline mechanics interjected. The others in the room added their shared opinion. Curtis knew it was hopeless and quietly gave up. In the commercial and cargo shipping business, keeping running costs low for the ship is part of the trade of returning the profit on journeys, even if it means cutting a few corners. Curtis has kept notes of how only the main engine is maintained perfectly, and on the other hand has documented how basic maintenance performed on the generators and only overhauled when absolutely necessary, instead of going by a set hour interval to save money. As the freighter vessel was encountering some rough water, rocking from side to side, a small, wiry tentacle stuck itself onto the hull. After that thing noticed the vessel's heat signature from deep below in a freezing part of the Atlantic Ocean. Most of it remained submerged, sticking to the hull by one tentacle, riding rough waters on the vessel's hull. Something had been stirred from its eons-long slumber. It climbed up the hull, slapping and stretching its borderline shapeless aquatic body. On the bridge, the captain, a stout polar bear everyone refers to as Captain Jim, noticed what resembled a small brownish and black smudge on the poop deck outside in the violent winter storm at sea. "Are you seeing this? Well, send Edgar to investigate, pronto," Captain Jim ordered, watching from the bridge, staring out of an ice-covered window. Edgar White, one of the Arctic Foxes on board as part of the crew, prepared to go out in the cold by bundling up in heavy winter gear. "I don't know what the captain wants this time, as long as I get a vacation next week. If not, I swear to God he'll file report to whoever's in charge of boat safety or whatever the fuck," Edgar grumbled, begrudgingly put on a winter jacket for venturing outside. The Arctic Fox shut the heavy steel door behind him, slowly walking around on deck, trying not to be blown away by the wind. Edgar made it to the small poop deck, barely 6 feet wide, with only a metal guardrail protection from falling into the ocean. The freighter rocked from side to side, making him hold on to the guardrail as the Arctic Fox unfortunately got close to the ancient thing that had made its way up from the hull. The nameless aquatic being soon pounced on Edgar, making a new host out of the Arctic Fox. In the crew accommodation areas, Robert had finished stopping the bleeding on his head from freshly shedding a set of antlers. The moose took a cigarette break, leaning against a hallway wall. Edgar limped along the hallway with torn-up winter gear, as if the Arctic Fox had been mauled by a large feral creature. "Hey, what happened out there? Need some first aid?" Robert asked, concerned and confused upon smelling blood. Edgar didn't answer, continued to limp along unfazed. Curtis took a snack break in his own quarters, making a BLT with extra bacon, with a special sauce being a mix of sriracha and mayonnaise as a spread. The Lynx had long become accustomed to late-night snacks and making weird food combinations with whatever scratch from the fridge was available. Curtis knew better to secure everything either in the drawer or by anything related to storage, so nothing falls or causes a mess in his room. His neat room showed how he's the type of Lynx to do everything ship-related by the book, or by doing a standard procedure better than what a sometimes flawed handbook reads. "What's up with Edgar?" George questioned Robert upon spotting the cigarette-smoking moose. "I know, he's acting weird. I just think his limb and his coat was all torn up." Robert spoke indifferently, taking a long draw from a cigarette before asking, "Want a dart?" With a spare pack of smokes on the ready. "Nah, I don't do tobacco. Everything I smoke is all green." George turned down the offer of free cigarettes, instead taking out another joint to light as a Timberwolf simply to give a damn. "Okay, don't say I didn't offer," Robert chuckled, not understanding what the Timberwolf meant. "Attention, men. There have been 2 casualties in crew accommodations. Everyone report to the bridge immediately." Captain Jim's voice crackled over the intercom speakers, and almost on command, everyone dropped what they were doing to head up the bridge. George, Robert, and Curtis met up next to each other on the bridge, where the polar bear captain waited for everyone remaining alive on board to be there for making an announcement. "There have been 2 murders. They don't look at any workplace accidents. There is a killer on board. My orders are now to stop the vessel and drop the anchor. When we turn around after the storm, the RCMP is going to deal with whoever did it accordingly." Captain Jim gave the news in person, squinting at everyone suspiciously. Everyone was now a little scared, despite Captain Jim remaining calm for the crew's sake. "The cargo and profit be damned. Money means nothing compared to the lives of my crew," the captain thought, knowing he was going to be reprimanded for this calamity, but didn't care in the slightest. The crew soon got back to their jobs. The mechanics and whoever else in the engine room were tasked with shutting off the gigantic main engine and dropping the anchor. George, Robert, and Curtis met up in the crew cabin hallways. "Hey guys, we should stick together." Curtis spoke up as the voice of reason, being the most logical of the 3. Doesn't Scooby-Doo tell us splitting up is a good idea?" Robert confidently protested, making it evident the moose watches maybe a little too much television. I'm stoned right now. Don't even know what you're on to think that's okay," George bickered, resisting the urge to smack the moose upside the head. And so the three became a three-person team. Curtis, the mechanic, Robert, the dunce, George, the slacker. Nothing like a lynx, a moose, and a timber wolf to try and survive on board. Meanwhile, Edgar is becoming a little uneasy. A murderer? Is anybody suspicious lately? Why is this happening now at sea? The Arctic fox thought after putting on a new set of clothes, very wary while walking the definitely quiet halls. Edgar is woefully unaware of what goes on, having random gaps in his memory on board since that thing pounced on him, feeling something rooted inside of him and brushing it off as minor chest pains. Curtis, Robert and George stayed in each other's sight the whole time when moving around the freighter, investigating who the culprit could be. There aren't any security cameras or any semblance of a CCTV system on board the freezing freighter vessel. Eventually, the main engine was shut down and the anchor was dropped, making it clear nobody was going anywhere until the storm was over. Navigating the vessel was daunting and nauseating as it rocked from side to side. Being here was not for anyone faint of heart or prone to seasickness, partially why a crew's hiring standards are more stringent than the typical 9 to 5. Anybody who wasn't accustomed to life sailing on merchant ships would vomit or panic, if not have a total mental breakdown in such a dire situation as what was taking place. I always wanted to go to Iceland. You heard it's pretty nice over there. George broke his silence, still talking with a joint in his mouth. Maybe when all this is over we can, Curtis admitted, as the lynx grabbed a broomstick to hold the weapon. A thick, musty air loomed, with Robert reeking of cigarette smoke. One could easily smell the marijuana on George's clothes. Nobody's making me clean floors. Might as well light one up. Robert talked to himself, pulling out another cigarette to smoke. Isn't that like your fifth? George mentioned, pointing to the freshly lit new cigarette. Probably. I forget. I remember when smoking a pack a day kept the doctor away. The moose replied nonchalantly, taking a long draw before exhaling. Robert is the oldest of the trio, being born in 1953 and nearing middle-aged. That moose is nothing short of a long-time chain smoker, with gaunt features to show for it. Curtis is the youngest of the trio, was also the only one of the three to attend university and actually graduate. A lynx not trying to prove anything and only doing his best is always in the feline's nature. Curtis is obviously the only one who doesn't smoke or drink, but is reserved about it. The trio of entering through the crew cabins with caution. Something was amiss below in the engine room. Another lynx mechanic walked down halls with pipes and lines covering the walls. The lone lynx stopped in his tracks upon hearing footsteps scurrying from behind. Someone, or something, was stalking just out of view. The unsuspecting lynx began to walk faster. Lights in the engine room suddenly shut off until only the generator room had its lights on in the engine room. This gave the killer a chance to strike again, ripping the head off the lone lynx without a weapon. Now, 18 living crew members remain. The trio in the crew cabins overheard from their co-workers as somebody turned the lights off in the engine room, and nobody was willing to go in to investigate. Something's up. Let's say we go down there and switch the lights on, George suggested, coming up with an idea. Oh yeah, Robert agreed. Wait, here are some flashlights. We aren't tripping over each other in the dark, Curtis interjected, fetching 3 flashlights from a nearby closet stocked with equipment and safety gear like hard hats. The trio are the only ones actually sticking together. Almost everyone else on board was meandering around cluelessly. Captain Jim stayed on the bridge with 6 subordinates on edge, watching each other. Upon arriving down the dark engine room with flashlights in hand, the trio walked throughout the area in a place familiar to them, with Curtis naturally being the team leader, with the goal to make sure none of them get killed at sea. Put it out! We're in the engine room! Curtis hissed almost demandingly at a loud whisper, not wanting their position to be given away by the cigarette stink. All right, jeez. Can't I do anything? Smoking helps me think. Robert sadly sighed, hesitantly putting out the cigarette in hand. George was quietly thinking of a way to make an excuse to get out of doing any work. They took some time locating levers to flip and a breaker box to mess around with the switches before the lights came back on the engine room. When the lights switched back on, the trio saw a sight none of them expected. The body of a lynx had been decapitated with brute force, an Arctic wolf less disemboweled, and a moose torn to pieces. 3 crewmen dead on various floors of the vast, yet claustrophobic engine room. 16 living crew members, including the trio, were remaining. Curtis wasn't frightened as much as the lynx was saddened at the sight of people he knew slaughtered by something on board. Nobody saw it coming until it was too late. He wanted to say anything to make his 2 new friends less paranoid, but dread prevented words from being choked out. "Oh, that's it fucked. I didn't sign up to see this shit. I'm ready to leave," George snapped, the Timberwolf's high being killed by a grisly display of carnage unseen. "Well, this night just keeps getting worse," Robert says with wavering composure. The moose tried processed anxiety with what limited number of brain cells he had. Just as their voices could be heard in the engine room, Edgar woke up on the floor after another mental blackout. "Ugh, what the hell happened?" Edgar groaned, rubbing his forehead, suffering from searing chest pains and a throbbing headache. The Arctic fox got up, but feeling weak and strained from torn muscles rapidly repairing themselves some unknown cause. Edgar lazily walked upstairs to the top floor of the engine room to find the trio. "What's going on? What are you guys doing?" Edgar yawned, seemingly genuinely confused and oblivious. "There's a killer aboard this freighter. Watch yourself and don't go anywhere alone, okay?" Curtis finally spoke up, only trying to be helpful. "Captain told everyone there's a killer. We didn't hear anything else while we were there." Edgar brought up a good point, deciding to unofficially join the trio for now. They went back up to the crew cabins as a group of 4, exploring the living quarters of other crew members for loot. Robert only took every pack of cigarettes in sight. Curtis dropped the broomstick to pick up AA batteries for everybody's flashlights, and George had the munchies as raiding a fridge or 2. Edgar was shocked at how the freighter had slowly descended into chaos when he's every man for himself. Panic started to collectively set in at sea. After getting what they needed, the trio and Edgar began making their way to a communal living room, just 2 floors below the bridge to set up camp. As the trio made their way to an intended communal living room, Robert looked over his shoulder to find out Edgar was nowhere to be seen before the hallway lights turned off. "Where'd Edgar go?" The moose got the other 2's attention, mentioning the Arctic fox's mysterious disappearance. "Whoever's killing people on board must have got him," George says, half reassuringly, thinking from a more pessimistic view. "Well, don't say that. He probably had to go to the washroom," Robert nervously replied in a fit to stay positive. "You guys stay here. I'll go turn the lights back on," Curtis boldly stated, venturing off by himself to turn the lights back on. George and Robert looked at each other doubtfully. In the complete cover of darkness, that thing started picking off the crew one by one, consuming parts of victims for sustenance, remaining a sight unseen. Now, only 12 living crew members remained. So far, none of the dead even saw the thing coming, nor heard it, for it was a stealthy being of aquatic origin. It was moving through the vents, going from floor to floor. Curtis walked along quiet hallways, pointing his flashlight at any odd noise to deter any signs of it getting to him. The lynx was determined to get off this freighter alive. Once the lights on the floor were switched back on, Curtis ran back to join George and Robert in the communal living room. Upon the lynx joining up with the 2, they all heard something moving in the vents. "What the hell is that?" George exclaimed, looking up to stare at the ventilation ducts. "A bug?" Robert added as the moose was only oblivious. "I think it's way too big to be just a bug," Curtis answered, turning his flashlight off to save battery. As this was happening, at the bridge, Captain Jim got to flipping switches on the panel to set a course back towards Nova Scotia when the icy storm died down. The stout polar bear noticed there were 5 others on the bridge with him, instead of 6 like a few minutes ago. "I need to do a head count," Captain Jim told his 5 subordinates on the bridge for going up the intercom system. "Attention! Everyone report to the bridge immediately. If you're alive, then get up here like your life depends upon it." Captain Jim made an announcement through all the vessel's overhead intercom speakers that crackle when being used. Everyone on board rushed upstairs, including the trio upon hearing the announcement. Soon enough, everyone living was on the bridge with the captain. Mike, a cougar, was holding a camcorder to record everything since the whole chaos broke out. A total of 10 living people remained on the freighter. Curtis, George, Robert, Edgar, Captain Jim, Mike, and 4 others added for a total of 10. It seems that thing got 2 more kills in while crewmen were making their way to the bridge. Who or what on this ship has killed just over half of us? What all of you are trying to tell me, none of us knows what it looks like. I've managed to radio the Canadian Coast Guard. They won't be coming until the weather calms down. Right now it's 20 below outside and the wind is blowing at 50 knots. The seas are too rough for safe travel, as you all can see. Captain Jim told everyone as the freighter shook violently from side to side and things fell onto the floor with coffee mugs shattering and pencils rolling along the linoleum tile floor. The captain and the crew were used to harsh conditions at sea, but hadn't come across anything like this, with the weather anywhere close in severity before. Everyone was now on edge, unable to trust one another, beginning to accuse each other of various outlandish things, even some of the murders. Now everyone was arguing with each other. Mike stood silently, recording the calamity. Captain Jim watched with a disappointed expression, seeing how the crew wasn't handling it well. George and Curtis were trying to come up with logical counter-arguments. Robert was on the verge of an anxiety attack, deciding to smoke 2 cigarettes at once to deal with it. The moose was smoking like a chimney and didn't care that everyone else was breathing a whole ton of second-hand smoke. Captain Jim watched his inner survival instincts reveal themselves in ugly display, with reason taking the back seat. "Enough!" Captain Jim shouted, making the bridge go quiet so suddenly. All eyes were on the polar bear. "Everyone split into teams of 3 and do patrol rounds until help arrives. We can't be herded here and be here like sitting ducks. I'll stay to keep track of communications on the radios." The polar bear gave the crew a new set of directives to carry out. That was enough for everyone except the captain to leave the bridge, to begin wandering around the vessel without a clear goal, apart from not dying. Edgar was paranoid of the 2 other crewmen he went with. "Who is it? Could one of them be the killer? I don't want to die," the Arctic Fox thought as he walked with the team he decided to stay with. Meanwhile, George, Curtis and Robert stayed together as a trio. "I have a bad feeling about everything." Robert shuddered, continuously chain-smoking, leaving behind cigarette butts and going through a pack of cigarettes in an hour. "You can say that again," George replied, was quickly cut off by the echoing screams of pain in the distance. The trio ran the opposite direction where the screams were coming from out of pure instinct. They, at this point, were looking after themselves despite other crewmen being mutilated. Whatever that thing is, it got even more carnage under its belt to satiate those carnivorous primal urges. Mike, the camera-holding cougar, was the only survivor in his group, wandering alone. Edgar woke up alone on the floor of a random crew cabin bathroom, wearing nothing but a pair of green khaki pants and worn work boots. "What happened?" The Arctic Fox grunted, feeling sick, struggling to get up, yet managed to get back on his feet. Edgar was confused why he was stripped of most of his clothes, and continued to wander in the freighter vessel in nothing but a pair of pants and some work boots. The Arctic Fox grabbed a flashlight to see where he was going. Now only 6 survivors remained. 15 were dead, mutilated, partially eaten, torn apart, all in unfathomably grotesque ways. What's happening to me? I feel fucking sick. Fuck. Edgar talked to himself. The Arctic Fox felt soreness all over his body. He's confused, wondering how he keeps ending up in random places, not having any memory of how he got there at all. Edgar walked down long, quiet hallways alone, walking past displays of brutality and death, step over still wet puddles of blood moving the ship rocking from side to side. Captain Jim stayed on the bridge alone to monitor navigation systems that were cutting edge in 1980, but were already dated as of 1991. Most of the CRTs and other tech were installed in the late 1970s during the freighter's construction. Captain Jim's the polar bear as a way of working with the limitations of tech the vessel's corporate owners are too cheap to update. Mike went back up the bridge a few minutes later, breathing heavily, visibly panicked. "Captain, I repeat, it's not a person," Mike wheezed, trying to warn the polar bear about something. "What?" Captain Jim added, raising a brow, turned around to see Mike sweating bullets and still holding that VHS camcorder in one hand. "It's not a person," Mike reiterated, shuddering with every word. Captain Jim honestly didn't know how to respond, and still assumed Mike was just seeing things. Edgar went back up to the bridge, following the sounds of rushing footsteps in that direction. Meanwhile, "I think we should head back to the bridge," Curtis mustered up, willing to defy the captain's orders in the name of self-preservation. "Well, while they're there, fuck the captain's orders. I quit," George scoffed, having no qualms quitting his job on the spot. "Well, I'm going to need a whole carton of darts hanger off this boat." Robert told his two friends the first thing he wants when help arrives. The moose flicked away a couple of cigarette butts to light another fresh cigarette, smoking like a damn chimney. The trio eventually made their way up to the bridge to only see Edgar, Captain Jim, and Mike. "Where did everyone else go?" Curtis spoke up, asking nobody in particular. "Dead," Edgar and Mike unintentionally said in unison. Now the Lynx regretted asking. "How are you?" Mike began interrogating Edgar, pointing the camcorder at the Arctic Fox. "I don't remember," Edgar answered honestly, genuinely oblivious. "Why are most of your clothes missing?" Mike bickered on the verge of starting another shouting match. This wasn't looking good for anyone involved. Mike decided to distance from everybody else, trusting no one in the slightest. "It's you! We hardly saw you at this whole mess. Why were you? I know it's you!" Mike went on an unhinged tangent, pointing the camcorder at Edgar, who had no idea what was going on. Curtis and George watched intently at the exchange. "I think I'm going to be sick," Edgar coughed. Everyone watched Edgar hunch over to place a hand on a navigation desk to support his weight. The Arctic Fox lost all control, beginning to transform. Shifting tendons, extra teeth, eyes turning obsidian black with amber irises. That was only the beginning. Violent coughing and guttural belching showed the Arctic Fox in clear pain. Curtis knew it wasn't Edgar. It was something using Edgar as a host. Are you feeling sick, Edgar?" Captain Jim asked, visibly concerned. Barely a moment later, Edgar's torso leaned backwards, as a spiked, brownish tentacle burst out of the Arctic Fox's chest like a bullet to pierce Captain Jim's skull like a pen being stabbed through a cardboard box. Captain Jim fell to the floor as dead weight, dying in the matter of seconds right before everyone's eyes. "Oh, fuck this!" George panicked, rushing out of the bridge with Robert and Mike. Curtis immediately ran behind to catch up with the rest of the survivors. They'd watched an Arctic Fox seen as cute and fluffy turn to distort into a monster controlled by a thing of corruption. Edgar began to chase the survivors while in a mental blackout and the control of something else. Robert stopped to grab a table to use as a shield and a wooden chair to wield as a weapon for holding off Edgar while everyone else ran. Curtis looked over his shoulder, running, shocked at the moose's sudden bravery. "Don't worry about me. Get out of here," Robert shouted to the others while holding off Edgar. The moose held the mutated Arctic Fox off for only minutes, hitting him with a chair repeatedly until Edgar ripped the make-do shield away. Robert had sacrificed himself for the other survivors. His last moments in pure agony had been impaled by different types of spiked tentacles and bleeding out on the floor. George, Curtis and Mike only had each other left on board. George and Curtis both proceeded to pick up random objects to use as weapons or shields like what Robert did. Mike only watched, still holding a camcorder to record everything. Edgar, now a much taller entity with two sets of jaws, two additional tails resembling fleshy vines covered in patchy white fur, and fast approaching with an exposed chest cavity, revealing spinning circular jaws with shark-like teeth inside of each other, breaking every possible law of nature. It was ready to hunt for more weaker prey. Edgar quickly caught up with the three survivors that were ready to go outside into the icy winter blizzard. The survivors went outside crew accommodations, into the storm raging outside. Mike held onto the steel railing for dear life, as wind blowing at 50 knots threatened to blow him overboard into the freezing ocean. Edgar began to slowly chase George and Curtis from the main deck, now towards the forecastle at the very front of the vessel. George and Curtis each held a wooden table as a crude shield from spiked tentacles pecking in their direction. It was a battle for survival, with all the power in one being beyond words. If we don't make it, I just want to say thanks for helping me get this far. George confessed to his new friend, having a high level of respect for the Lynx. That means a lot, Curtis replied as they both cornered the vessel's forecastle by Edgar. It was now the last stand for them, even if it meant the end. Edgar pounced, but was blocked by Curtis and George using the table as effective make-do shields. Holy hell, he's strong, George grunted, barely pushing away Edgar's brute force. The timber wolf and Lynx were pushed until their backs were against the steel railing edge of the freighter's forecastle, getting a good view of the freezing ocean from where they were. Don't give up, Curtis ordered, pushing harder as a new plan formed. Without words spoken, both George and Curtis got an idea to trip Edgar, tripping the entity by kicking his legs. When Edgar finally tripped, falling off the table shields, George and Curtis pushed him level and entity overboard with their tables. Edgar fell into the water below, sinking into the freezing depths. Curtis sat down, not caring how cold it was. Mike approached the two, continued to hold the camcorder, still recording the whole thing. You saved all our assets. I can't believe we made it. The camera-wielding cougar laughed awkwardly, still hearing his heartbeat in his ears. They went back inside to avoid freezing to death and waited on the bridge. There was plenty of food, since it was just the three of them left. Help wouldn't arrive for another 2 days, till the storm let up only enough for the Canadian Coast Guard to rescue them. During the time between waiting for rescue and after pushing Edgar into the ocean, the three survivors recorded several logs recalling the events of what happened on VHS tapes. What truly happened on board that freighter was covered up by the Canadian government to prevent fear from being spread to the world that was reporting extensively on the tragedy. The three survivors were kept anonymous and didn't want to be interviewed for any reason. Some of the footage from Mike's camera was copied onto other VHS tapes and sent to journalists in the media who didn't see the full story. Most of the footage actually was released, but the parts showing Edgar in a mutated form were permanently kept from the public eye in the evidence archives of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Bodies of victims on board were identified and given proper burials by grieving families later. However, Edgar's body was never found. The media was dumbfounded at how Edgar White, a seemingly normal Arctic fox with no criminal history or any history of violence with a reputation of being a pacifist, would go on a sudden killing spree with no weapons. A cover-up that the news bought was the Prime Minister saying, "The motives of Edgar White remain unknown. It is strongly believed that the Arctic fox had multiple personality disorder." Statements from the survivors claiming to be true, with Edgar not remembering any of the murders and recounting symptoms of mental blackouts. A long story short, the survivors say some other personality took control and started killing the crew members in February of 1992. Multiple personality disorder was the most believable story the Canadian government could churn out. The investigation into supernatural and anomalous entities was secretly taken over by American intelligence agencies with no internal resistance, as the Americans had more experience with those sorts of cases that are kept classified. Canada was just trying to wash its hands of the tragedy, and the CIA was more than glad to step in. The ship itself was taken out of service during the investigation for a span of 6 months, before being given back to the corporate owners who had the freighter cleaned and renamed, while being promptly put back into service in late 1992. The latest known headline surrounding the ship was it being fitted with a more efficient propeller in 2008 to keep the vessel in service, reduce fuel consumption, and not much else. During the investigation, the company that owned the freighter refused to comment or issue any statements or answer any questions surrounding the incident. In January of 1992, George, Curtis and Mike quit their jobs to establish the Northern Investigators Society as independent journalists. They knew things were being covered up by their government and the press alike. The truth always remains hidden to the commoner by those who only see you or everyone in the general population as nothing but ignorant metaphorical sheep. When another thing like Edgar tears you to pieces, nobody will believe the witnesses, and don't expect your government to help either. You're on your own. Will your death be avenged, or until it appears if you never even existed? Go on. Venture deeper into the water and find out. Don't let those spiked tentacles grab you to be pulled deeper into dark, murky depths. That was the fourth story from Corruption of Anemoia by MC Morrado. It is available to buy as an ebook on Barnes & Noble. I will put the link in the description if you want to check it out and maybe buy it. I recommend it. It's an interesting little anthology of horror stories. So thanks for MC Morrado for asking me to do this. We will be having a couple more stories leading up to Halloween, and I still need to do one of my own sometime in November. It's we're a bit behind on things, as I mentioned before. As far as Saturday goes with the VN, I still don't know what it is, but there will be a short story coming up on Thursday from this same anthology. Before I go, as always, I'd like to say thank you to all my donors on Ko-fi and Patreon. And special member to my top patrons who are Kartek, Kobus Visser, Lexi Bucciarati, Bastian, Brian Hall, Tiger Cub, Ada Corval, Anubis Silverwind, Dissonance, Grizz, Spiderling, Kopi, Sindri Dragowolf, Evan King, Exact, Aaron Fox, Mohammed Al-Zamel, Andy Peng, Smuto, Omar, Nova Starburn, Harvest Mouse Productions, and Baker. Thanks to all of them. And until we turn with another spooky story in just a few days, good night out there, whatever you are.